So now that we've had some time with the latest beta, let's talk about Escoffier and Ifa, two very different characters who've both made strong impressions on testers, though not always for the same reasons. I'll start with Escoffier because honestly, her arrival is probably the best thing to happen to Cryo teams in a long time. And after that, we'll get into Ifa, whose case is, well, a little more complicated. Save up to 23% on the current banners at lootbar.gg. All you need is your UID and server. The link is in the description. Now, if you're someone who's been playing since Mondstadt or Liyue days, you might remember a time when freeze teams were considered top tier. There was something so satisfying about turning the battlefield into an ice rink and just snapping through frozen enemies. But over time, Cryo fell out of favor. The game's meta started to shift, elemental reactions evolved, and by the time we reached the 5.x series, freeze teams were practically extinct. That's why Escoffier's arrival feels almost nostalgic, and at the same time exciting. Right from the start, testers noticed how similar she felt to Emily. They're both Fontaine characters, both polearm users, and both bring long-duration skill effects that make them really useful off-field. But Escoffier takes that support role a step further. She's not just some filler unit you throw in because she fits an element. She's capable of boosting Cryo teams in a way that makes them actually feel competitive again, especially for characters like Ayaka and Ganyu. One of her biggest strengths is how low-cost and efficient she is. You don't need to be swapping her in all the time or rotating like crazy to make her kit work. She applies a 32% team-wide damage buff and can shred up to 55% cryo resistance from enemies. And that's just the beginning. She also contributes sub-DPS damage, has 2 ways to heal, and still barely needs field time. It's honestly kind of wild how much she does with so little effort. There's this common misconception that she's only usable in freeze teams, but that's not entirely true. While Cryo is definitely her specialty, her kit is solid enough to support other elemental comps too. The only exception is that Cryo resistance shred, it won't help anyone outside of Cryo, but everything else from buffs to heals to sub-DPS still works fine. And the fact that you get so much value from Constellation 1 is borderline broken. If you're wondering whether she actually makes Cryo characters relevant again, the answer is yes. Especially Ayaka. Ayaka has been sitting in a weird spot for a while. Power crept by newer characters who were flashier or easier to build around. But with Escoffier, Ayaka starts to feel like a serious contender again. Her nuke-style skill set doesn't rely heavily on normal attacks, so she benefits a ton from the C2 Escoffier effect, which the whole team can trigger up to 5 times. That specific synergy works best with nukers like Ayaka and Ganyu. Ryothsley, on the other hand, really struggles to activate the effect in a useful way, which is kind of unfortunate, especially considering how powerful he was expected to be when first released. It's tempting to think that pairing Escoffier with Neuvillette would be strong too. After all, she's a powerful support, and he's an insane DPS, so why wouldn't it work? But the synergy just isn't quite there. Neuvillette already has one of the most optimized team comps in the game, and throwing Escoffier into that lineup is like putting spinach and strawberries in a smoothie. It might sound okay in theory, but in practice, they're better enjoyed separately. As for how to build her, some testers have been going the traditional route with buffer support artifacts, and that works fine. But others have found success with Golden Troop. Since Escoffier can do meaningful sub-DPS damage, giving her critical rate, critical damage, and attack percentage stats actually makes a lot of sense. You end up with a character who can contribute to the fight while still boosting your main DPS. The only thing to keep in mind is her energy recharge. You'll want around 155% or more if you're running her with cryo mains like Ayaka, along with Shenhei and Furina. That team in particular seems to be one of her best comps right now. Now, while her C2 and R1 setup is probably the sweet spot for unlocking her full potential, don't feel pressured to go that far. Even at Constellation 0 and Refinement 1, Escoffier is genuinely solid, and if you're not pulling for her but you happen to pick up her signature weapon, it's not a waste. It's actually useful for characters like Ianson or Chevreuse too. That makes it one of those rare weapons that's valuable even outside of its intended kit, which is always a plus. Overall, Escoffier feels like a much-needed win for Cryo mains. She brings relevance back to characters who were slowly slipping out of the meta, and she does it in a way that feels fun and versatile without being clunky or overly demanding. But then we have Ifa, and yeah, Ifa's situation is a lot harder to talk about positively. His design is interesting, his animations are stylish, and he even has a unique flying mechanic at higher constellations, but none of that really saves him from feeling underwhelming in actual combat. The biggest issue is that he feels like a character whose full potential is locked behind constellations, and not just one or two. You basically need C6 to make him functional. At C0, Ifa's healing is barely usable. He struggles to keep up with Furina's HP drain, which makes him a poor fit in teams that rely on high max HP characters like Nilou, Neuvillette, or Furina herself. Unless your whole team has low HP thresholds, he just can't keep up. That alone makes him hard to recommend as a primary healer unless you're deep into the Constellation path. You can technically use Ifa as a main DPS, but again, only if you have C6, and even then, he doesn't really compete with the 5 stars you probably already have. His damage just isn't there. He's easy to use, sure, much simpler than Mizuki, for example, and you can support him with things like Yelan's Burst, but the ceiling is low. It feels like a build that's more about novelty than viability. On top of that, his targeting feels awkward. If you're standing still and facing an enemy, it's fine. But if you try to move and attack at the same time, his projectiles have a tendency to veer off in strange directions. It's not confirmed whether this is a bug or just a design quirk, but either way, it really hurts his consistency. What's interesting, though, is his flying mechanic at C6. It's surprisingly useful if you don't have Chaska, because the experience is kind of similar. He lets you fly across the map. The control is noticeably worse than Chaska's, but for overworld exploration, or just having a convenient flying character in your party, he's not bad. In fact, he might honestly be more useful as a flying taxi than as a combat unit, which is both amusing and kind of sad when you think about it. The most frustrating thing is that Ifa's design doesn't feel far off from something that could have worked, but by splitting his scaling between elemental mastery for healing and critical attack stats for DPS, he ends up pulled in 2 directions, and neither is strong enough to stand on its own. A more unified build path could have made him a lot more viable, even as a 4-star. As it stands now, the impression from testers is that he's capped before he even gets going, and unless something big changes before release, he might just be one of those characters you build for fun, but not for actual content. So that's where we're at right now. Escoffier is looking like a true standout, especially for Cryo players, while Ifa, despite his charm, feels like a missed opportunity. Hopefully, there's still room for adjustments before final release, but until then, what do you think? Are you planning to pull for either of them? Do you see yourself rebuilding an old Cryo team, or are you tempted by Ifa's flight gimmick? Let me know in the comments. I'm really curious how others feel about these two. And as always, if you want to stay updated on more beta reviews, don't forget to subscribe. Save up to 23% on the current banners at lootbar.gg. All you need is your UID and server. The link is in the description.